theory is not. And then we'll talk a little bit about what it is. And then I would like to transition into what I think is a deep connection between some of the fundamental ideas of critical race theory and Seventh-day Adventist theology, right? Critical race theory is not taught in elementary school. It is not taught in high school. The current movement to keep critical race theory out of elementary school and out of high school is a solution in search of a problem. If you went to your average sixth grader here in Los Angeles and asked something about critical race theory, they have no idea what you're talking about. They not only would have no idea what you're talking about, the teachers in the school wouldn't have any idea what you're talking about because it just is not taught at the elementary and high school level. Now, if you're on the far right of the political spectrum and you're trying to drum up support to keep your political candidates in power, then you have to create a boogeyman. And that's essentially what people on the far right have done. They have created a straw man that attributes certain things to critical race theory that simply aren't true. And one of them is that your children are being indoctrinated with our tax dollars to believe in some far left-wing ideology that says white people are evil. And we shouldn't have that, okay? So that's false. It's not that. It does not teach that white people are evil, which is what a lot of whites would have you believe. Critical race theory is being taught in schools, and it teaches that white people are inherently evil just because they are white, okay? What critical race theory does do is it says that racism in America is permanent, and because racism in America is permanent, there are white people who today benefit from the legacy of oppression that their forebears instituted. That is true, right? It's something that we call white privilege, right? If you're white in America, you have a certain benefit that I don't have. When I get pulled over by a policeman, I have an entire set of considerations I have to manage that are life or death considerations, right? A white person does not have to do that. I mean, that's just true, okay? So let me just say that critical race theory is not this thing that's being used to indoctrinate our children that teaches racism. Let's talk a little bit about what it is. Critical race theory is a legal theory and a social theory, a legal theory first, social theory probably second, that began formally in the early to mid 1970s as civil rights lawyers from the previous generation began to see that the Supreme Court of the United States was undoing many of the victories that had been won. And one of those civil rights lawyers was an African American named Derek Bell. Derek Bell is from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He got his law degree from the University of Pittsburgh in 1957. He graduated and he immediately went to work for the NAACP, litigating cases around the country on desegregation. But at that time, Derek Bell came in to the legal profession. It wasn't so much about school desegregation, which the Brown decision had theoretically ended. It was about the South's resistance to integration in the schools. So much of the work of the NAACP was about getting protesters for sit-ins bailed out of jail, right? This was the resistance phase. So you had all these people nowadays, you hear many conservative whites will talk about the rule of law and how important it is. And yet, after the Brown decision, you had Southern officials, governors, etc., literally standing on the steps of their state house, like George Wallace, saying segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. We are not going, we don't care what the Supreme Court says. Excuse me? We don't care what the Supreme Court says. We are going to do it our way. So there's a complete rejection of the rule of law if the rule of law means I have to do something to help end white supremacy. But in every other circumstance, we have to have the utmost respect for the rule of law. Listen to the forthcoming confirmation hearings for soon-to-be Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. You will hear her speak of, as she should, as a jurist, she will speak of the importance of the rule of law. She will talk about how everyone has to follow the rules and so forth and so on. And a lot of that is judge speak that she sort of has to do in order to negotiate her way through the process. But it isn't just lip service, right? There's something to that. And so Derek Bell enters the legal profession in this context of needing to help black protesters, some whites were protesting and at sit-ins and so forth, but he enters into the law in this historical context, and then he starts to see, after he became a member of the bar, I think in 1957, and then 10 years later, 3 years later, President Johnson nominated Thurgood Marshall to serve on the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit in New York. And in some ways, there's an old saying among lawyers that lawyers have to become domesticated when they become judges. And Thurgood Marshall was white America's worst nightmare. I mean, I don't know if you've heard the stories of him, but this is a black man who was going into Mississippi and Alabama in the late 1930s and 40s and defending black people who were accused of capital murder for no money at all, right? He was paid by the NAACP, which couldn't afford to pay him too much, okay? And so he was going to court and he was winning. He was winning case after case after case. And so what ends up happening? Well, the best way to put a stop to that is make him a judge, right? And at the time, I think Thurgood Marshall was tired of running around. He had to do everything he had to do in his car. He couldn't use bathrooms in Mississippi and Alabama. So he had to have a jar in his car. He had to have a typewriter in his car. He would sit there and peck, right? And everything had to be spelled correctly, had to be just so. In fact, one judge said to him, he said, the court is going to take a break, everybody except Mr. Marshall, and Mr. Marshall, you have to stand here like the nigger that you are and talk to an empty courtroom. And when I come back, I better hear you reciting your arguments. So he did it, right? When Thurgood Marshall went into town, it would be a black funeral home in the town who would send out a coffin. And he would have to get in the coffin to get into town, and they would bring him into the back of the funeral home, and they would have food prepared there for him. Somebody from the local church, somebody ought to say amen, right? They'd have food ready for him to eat, and he said, I never minded eating around dead people because there was always more for me. You know? And he said, I never minded coming into town in a coffin, as long as I didn't leave in one, right? And I mean, these are sort of anecdotes that, you know, make us chuckle, but this is what he faced. And he was wildly successful. So one of the best ways to put a stop to that was to sort of domesticate him so he became a judge. And frankly, because of all his experiences, he thought he deserved it, right? Which is probably true. So Thurgood Marshall is now no longer winning cases. He's a judge, so judges are not advocates. So judges have to behave differently, right? The friendships he had, the network, the community he was a part of, he had to cut people off, you know? I mean, Thurgood was known for drinking and smoking and telling dirty jokes, and he never stopped telling dirty jokes, by the way. He continued to do that while he was on the Supreme Court. But he had to change and do things differently, and that left the movement, from a legal standpoint, at something of a crossroads, right? It almost started to fall apart. And so Derek Bell sees this transition, and then in the early 1970s, he sees the Supreme Court banish affirmative action, and he sees the Supreme Court essentially doing nothing on school desegregation, but making school segregation worse. And so he's disillusioned, and he begins, along with a number of other scholars, a Latino scholar named Richard Delgado, who sees the same trends he does. And in the mid-1970s, I think it was, there was a conference, an academic conference, and they got together. And what emerged out of that conference were a series of papers that talked about this new idea called critical race theory. And it's driven by three main principles. One, racism is permanent. It is a permanent fixture of American society. It's not something accidental. It's not on the periphery. It is front and center. And it affects everything we do. That's principle number one. Principle number two of critical race theory is something called interest convergence. And interest convergence is the idea that every time we think what we see is racial progress, is really just the hopes and dreams of black people coincidentally intersecting with the interests of white people. That's all it is. So here you go. We got a lot of good Adventists here. Y'all call me out on this if I get this wrong. So let's take the Emancipation Proclamation. Did slavery end because America thought it was morally wrong? No. Slavery ended because Abraham Lincoln was faced with the choice of keeping slavery and the Union dissolving, or ending slavery and saving the Union. The Emancipation Proclamation was not about anything moral when it came to slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation was about the interests of the United States, and a lot of that interest was not just political interests of whites, but financial interests of whites. And this is why slavery came to an end. One of the Seventh-day Adventist Church founders, Uriah Smith. Uriah Smith writes an essay called The United States in Light of Prophecy. Now, Uriah Smith is a Millerite who, after the Great Disappointment, is still negotiating, finding his way, navigating his way through. And in The United States in Light of Prophecy, Uriah Smith says that America's failure to end slavery because it was morally wrong will haunt her for generations to come. Okay? And what's so powerful about that is that Uriah Smith is the one that gives us our doctrine of Revelation 13 about America and her role in prophecy. So we'll come to that toward the end, right? So the first thing is racism is permanent. Second thing is interest convergence. You want to know another example of interest convergence? The election of Barack Obama as president of the United States. Total interest convergence. Y'all know what was happening. I can't believe that was 14 years ago. This time 14 years ago, Barack Obama was running for president. And if you remember correctly, September of 2008, just after Labor Day, or just right around the Labor Day holiday, John McCain was ahead in the polls. And then what happened? The bottom fell out on Wall Street. And middle class and upper middle class white people who had retired as millionaires when Bill Clinton left office were now forced to go back and work at Wendy's and y'all remember the stories on TV? You remember there was one guy who said, I've been bleeding about $100,000 a week out of my retirement account because of profligate Wall Street spending, right? And if you remember correctly, what happened after that was the Occupy movement, right? We are the 1%, right? We are the 99%, rather. It's 1% of the people got up, so there was all the critiques of wealth and capitalism and all this and that. But here's what's interesting. Barack Obama didn't win because America thought America was no longer racist. Barack Obama won because in that field of candidates, he was the one who looked like he was the most competent to fix the problem that was causing white people to lose all their money. John McCain, rest his soul. The fundamentals of the economy are strong. No, they're not. Not when a month ago I had $4 million in the bank, and today I'm working at the drive-thru at Wendy's, and I'm 72. No, the fundamentals of the economy are not strong. What was Sarah Palin talking about? I can see Russia from my window. And white people are looking at this choice, and they're like, who gonna help us? Them or this dude? Harvard educated, president of the Harvard Law Review. Mother was a white woman. So, I mean, he doesn't hate white people. So he saved Jeremiah Wright. Remember that whole debacle? Right? The 2008 campaign. So let's just see something. Let's understand this. The night Barack Obama got elected, I almost got caught up. I was in graduate school. I lived in Memphis. And when I saw him and Malia and Sasha, they were tiny little kids at the time, and Michelle, they came out, Lincoln Park, Chicago, this beautiful night. I stopped. I was like, wow. And he opened his, first thing he said when he opened his mouth is change has come to America. I was like, whoa, man. And then instantly I was brought back to earth because I thought about how living in Memphis, just across town, was the Lorraine Motel where Dr. King was shot and killed because he opposed militarism, racism, and poverty. And ain't none of that gonna change because Barack Obama's the president. Right? So interest convergence says, when you see a black president, when you see slavery end, it's not because America's doing the right thing. It's just because black people incidentally happen to have their interests merged with white people. And as soon as it don't matter to white people no more, guess what's going to happen? Right? So, number one, racism is permanent. Number two, interest convergence. And the third principle of critical race theory is the importance of counter-narratives or storytelling. Now, a lot of people don't like this because a lot of conservative Christians will balk at this because they say, oh, well, you don't just get to make things up. Really? Really? I don't know. Somewhere I read that a lawyer A Pharisee asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" And his response was, "A man was on his way from Jerusalem to Jericho." I think that's making it up. In fact, I think that's making it up as you go along to get this Pharisee to understand what he could not get him to understand if he just came out and told him he was a hypocrite. See, this is the power of narrative and story, is that stories enable you to see yourself in a way that you can't otherwise see yourself. Right? How many of y'all read Hamlet? You ever read Hamlet in high school or college? What did Hamlet do? Hamlet's whole objective throughout that play was to avenge the death of his father. And when Hamlet saw that, when Hamlet thought his uncle, Claudius, had killed his father, he didn't go up to him and accuse him. You know what he did? He hired actors to come from England and present a skit that was his theory of how his father died. And Shakespeare writes that when Claudius saw that skit, he stood up and stormed out. Right? In other words, what enabled him to see his guilt was the distance of having a story in between him and an accusation. Because now he was forced to look at himself. He was forced to see himself. I got one more example. You conservative Christians among the bunch who have a problem with fiction. Not only did Jesus teach in parables, but what happened when Nathan really wanted to get David to convert? He went up to him and told him a story. He said, "Hey, king, did you know that once there was a man who was a real powerful man, and there was a man didn't have any power at all? And the man that had power, he had sheep and oxen and cattle on 1,000 hill, and the other man just had one little sheep. And the man that had all the power went and took the sheep from the one man and killed it. You know, what should happen to that man? You know, David is up and, kill him, get him. And then Nathan just said to him, you are that man." And what does the scripture say? What was David's reaction? He repented because he saw himself. So critical race theory is interested in how we can tell and retell stories for the purpose of helping America, mostly white people, overcome their allergy to accountability. Right? And so Derek Bell's work in critical race theory is centered around taking actual historical events and restructuring them in ways that include things like science fiction in order to get white people to see just how racist America really is. So he has a book called, y'all will like this one, "And We Are Not Saved," based on Amos 8:20. The summer is gone, the harvest has come, and we are not saved. That's the title of the book. And We Are Not Saved, the title is The Elusive Quest for Racial Justice. And the first chapter is called The Chronicle of the Great Constitutional Contradiction. And this is my last point before I open it up for questions. And he takes you back to my hometown, Philadelphia. Got to have a plug for my city, you know what I mean? It's my hometown, right? I'm far from home, but I'm at home at Big T, I know that. I'm on safe ground here. So he takes you back to Philadelphia and he shows you the framers debating about what to do with slavery. That part is all true. He weaves in science fiction and has a black woman come from the future and land in the middle of the debate floor. And she's surrounded by a force field so nobody can get to her. And she tells them, you better get your act together because if you compromise on the humanity of black people now, this country will never be what you expect it to be. You will never reach the lofty rhetoric of your political documents because people who look like me will be enslaved. Now, this, I think, is brilliant as a literary technique because it forces us to, as a counter narrative, as a counter story, it forces an engagement between the people who are at the top of the totem pole and the people who are at the bottom, and specifically a black woman, right? So she comes out and she's talking, and what's fascinating about how this all turns out is you have people who are the framers who look at the black woman and say, she's nothing but a slave, get her out of here. Who's gonna listen to her? And this is the banter, this is the back and forth. And of course, nobody listens to her. I think Benjamin Franklin or somebody tries to go after her and apprehend her, and he's knocked back by the force field, and she's taken back up and taken away, right? That's a counter-narrative or a story designed to get people to see that the founding of America was problematic because we legislated the subhuman status of black people as a condition for the possibility of our country. Let me just put it in theological terms. In the beginning was the nigger. And the nigger was with America, and the nigger was America. The same was in the beginning with America. James Baldwin said white people have to figure out why it was necessary to have a nigger in the first place. You know why? Because without the nigger, there would be no America. Well, what is a nigger? A nigger is a subhuman being that is a mere object of the white consciousness. So you don't exist on your own. You don't have your own thoughts, feelings, hopes, dreams, fears, visions. You don't even have any history, right? So we're going to reduce you to a figment of our imagination and base our country on that. So let's understand this, that there would be no America were it not for that dehumanization, because think about it. Slavery had been in existence from 1619 all the way up to 1787. The Constitution of the United States did not do one thing to end slavery. Instead, it ensured its maintenance for the foreseeable future. And critical race theory says, how in the world, with an origin like that, can you ever expect the country to be anything other than racist? That doesn't mean every white person individually is a racist. But it means exactly, Pastor, that systems and institutions and structures have been established and norms have been transmitted from one generation to the next. That take the criminal justice system. Norms have been instituted from one generation to the next to, treat black people like what? Niggas. Because that's what you were in the beginning. One of Derek Bell's most famous insights is that we have moved on from Dred Scott and segregation intellectually, but our hearts and minds have not changed. Think about Breonna Taylor. Our hearts and minds haven't changed. Ahmaud Arbery. Prosecutors stand up in closing argument and talk about long, dirty toenails, like he's a runaway slave. That hasn't changed. George Floyd. Trayvon Martin. I mean, we could just go on, call the roll. Sandra Bland. Marlene Pinnock out here in California was nearly beaten to death by a California highway patrolman. He beat her so bad about her head. I had never seen anything like that. And then we normalize it by making videos, putting it on social media. Hey, want to see a black person die? All you got to do is open up your phone. And so the dehumanization of slavery is just recast over and over and over again. We have changed the letter of the law, but the spirit remains. So critical race theory says racism is permanent, interest convergence, and we're going to use narrative and story to induce a radical confrontation with the truth. And here's the real rub, and this is my last point, I promise. The real rub is Derek Bell tells us racism is permanent, but you have to continue to fight against it. Now that'll shake you up, right? Because what's the point in fighting something that's never going to go away? Right? Derek Bell, in an interview he gave, I would encourage you to look him up on YouTube and watch some of his. He's just brilliant. He died very sadly about 11 years ago, but he's very, very smart man. And the interviewer said to him, Professor Bell, how is it that you can say we have an obligation to fight against something that will never go away? And he said, you know, I think about people who are alcoholics. And even though they may have not had a drink in 30 years, they have to open up their mouth at every AA meeting and they have to say to themselves, hi, my name is Tim. I'm an alcoholic. I am not an alcoholic for the camera. But hi, my name is Tim. I'm an alcoholic and I will always be an alcoholic. Right? He said they tell them to do that because the moment they no longer consider themselves an alcoholic is the moment that they are primed to start drinking again. Because they take themselves to have arrived. So Derek Bell says if we tell ourselves that racism has no end, we're more inclined to never stop fighting against it. And even though we might not be able to win, we'll die fighting. That's what critical race theory is. It's not just some armchair pontification about white people being racist, as the far right would have you believe. Critical race theory is deeply moral and resonates with Adventism. Because what do we believe about America? We believe that America is the kingdom in Revelation 13 that will rise up and that will create an image to papal Rome through apostate Protestantism. Why? Because she has a bad habit of saying one thing and doing another. Now, a lot of white Adventists want to treat America's condition in Revelation 13 as a future event, but most black people understand it not to be a future event, but a systemic condition. It's a condition, it's a problem when you say one thing and do something else. That's a serious issue that we still deal with today. So you might not be as far away from critical race theory as you think. I'm going to stop there and then we'll open up for questions, comments, concerns, what have you. So maybe I should have bought my bulletproof vest faster. Thank you, Big T. Thank you so much. Sure.
Okay, there we go. The young men and young women at the church this morning, I was hoping that they would be here because we need our young adults to be engaged in this. But as you mentioned, Revelation 13, there seems to be a dichotomy within Seventh-day Adventism because this is the history of our teaching. But somehow we kind of, at least in the African-American Seventh-day Adventist Church, somehow we sometimes seem to distance things as it's not yet without knowing that you're living in prophecy. You follow what I'm saying? And so for the members that are here, for those who are here, like you mentioned the three, and we don't connect it to what the Bible says. You mentioned militarism, racism, and you said poverty, but I call it capitalism.
Capitalism, sure.
So militarism, racism, capitalism, and each of these are the spirits, or the spirits that come out of the frogs. One out of the dragon, one out of the beast, and one out of the land beast, the false prophets. So it's like these things, and we got militarism from Rome, we got racism here in America, we got capitalism from Europe, which is the premise of how we operate here. How do we as a church and the members here, African American members that do not see our brothers in Adventism, relate these things to the treatment of blacks? How do we get them on board to see prophecy that they claim to be steeped in as relevant and intricately interwoven into the treatment of their brothers?
I think that conversation has to happen by talking in theological terms, because the white brethren will relate to abstract theological ideas before they will relate to what they see as race-based politics. I love it when people say, because many conservative white theologians in Adventism will say things like the church shouldn't be political.
Right.
Wait a minute. We have an entire department of legislative affairs at the General Conference office in Tacoma Park, Maryland, devoted to politics.
That's right.
And religious liberty. One of the things I think, so we have to first remind folks that the church has always been political. So before you tell me not to be involved in politics, remember that.
Right.
And you have to remind people that Seventh-day Adventists today are the beneficiaries of a protest movement and the civil rights movement that at the outset they opposed. So let me just share this with you.
Exactly.
So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that President Lyndon Johnson signed into law on July 2nd of that same year, not only did it end Jim Crow, but what it also did is Title VII of it says that there can be no religious discrimination in the workplace. Now, that legislation came as a result of Dr. King and many others, black, white, whatever, who came together and said, America can do better. The Seventh-day Adventist Church, and you know this history, Pastor, the official position of the church was that the church should not be involved in protest movements. And the church went so far as to discipline or attempt to discipline several African American pastors.
That's correct.
Who decided that they were not going to be intimidated by church policy and actually march with Dr. King and provide help to protesters. Because the allegiance that they had to people in their community was greater than the allegiance that they had to the institution.
Can you say that again, please?
Their allegiance to people in their community was greater than the allegiance that they had to the institution.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating about all of this is today, if you're a Seventh-day Adventist, no matter what color you are, in the United States, you have a right to religious freedom in the workplace, and the Seventh-day Adventist Church structures so much of its lobbying and political activities around that very issue that we are in a position where we have reaped where we have not sown.
That's right.
You don't contribute any sweat, blood, and tears, but then you turn around and you reap all the benefits. There's something wrong with that, and the white brethren in the church need to understand that You can try to globalize the Seventh-day Adventist Church all you want, but in the end, this denomination was founded in the middle of a civil war in the United States.
That's right.
That was being fought over the question of what to do with 3.5 million black slaves.
That's right.
And the fractures, the social and political fractures of the country are reflected in the social and political fractures that prevail to this day in the church.
That's right.
We can have Sabbath school programs and talk about missions in Bangladesh, and we can talk all we want about the work around the world, but I think what has to be trumpeted to people to get them to see that we really are all in this together is the very simple, but I think profound fact that there is no Seventh-day Adventist theology that you can have independent of African American history.
That's right.
That those two things are inextricably
Inextricably
connected with one another.
That's right.
And if you try to do theology without history, it's like trying to have sex without love. You're just fornicating.
That's right.
You're looking for pleasure without responsibility. We want the pleasure of being right so bad, Pastor, that we have no concern for righteousness.
That's right.
And that's the problem.
That's the problem.
And the brethren need to understand that, because again, the real danger of having sex outside of love or outside of a committed relationship is that you're seeking pleasure without responsibility, and too many of us in the church are busy fornicating.
Yes.
Right?
That's right.
Because we are looking for the theological pleasure of being right, independent of any moral or spiritual responsibility or accountability to the community around us.
Now let me pause, and I said that's right, so let me do like you did for
Sure.
the camera. I am not a fornicator,
That's,
just as he's not a drinker.
but I hope you were ovulating this morning.
Yes, sir. And I just want to say, I asked this question in the public setting. Dr. Golden and I are friends. I could talk to him about this privately and things, but I want you all to hear this because these things have infiltrated into our setting. And you know, there's an old saying that somebody else sneezes and we catch the cold. And so some of us have a problem. Some of us have a problem talking about black things. Some of us have a problem or hearing certain things and, oh, this is uneasy, but we have no problem swallowing lies. We have no problem sitting under the images of lies. We have no problem hearing lies but as soon as truth comes along, truth makes us very uncomfortable. And I'm talking about among our own. Among our own. So I thank you for that, Dr. Golden. Okay, you can make your way to Brother Walker. As he comes, I personally invited a couple of brethren to this, and so just want you to look around to see how many brethren showed up.
Hello, Dr. Golden.
Hello, sir. How are you?
Thank you, first of all, for being here. I learned about my family history through storytelling from my dad, but I didn't get to know about black history until I was in college, okay? So my thought is, how come critical theory isn't being taught in elementary and junior high school and high school, as opposed to what we were taught about white superiority subliminal messages in elementary, junior high school, and high school?
Well, I think that's a good question. Thank you. I think sir, I'm sorry, could you tell me your name, sir?
I'm sorry, Jerome Walker.
Jerome Walker.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Brother Walker. I think that the reason it's not taught today is because it began as a sort of intellectual movement among lawyers, right? And so the inclination was, at the time that Derek Bell and Richard Delgado are developing the origins of critical race theory, which, by the way, has become about much more than Derek Bell. Critical race theory has sort of evolved over time, and there's some questions today about whether some things are really critical race theory or are they something else. I think that's going to be another book that I'm going to have to address, because sometimes I scratch my head at what gets considered to be critical race theory. But to your question, I think originally it was the frustration of Black and Latino intellectuals with what they saw as a failing legal system. And they saw that Black people and other folks of color had placed their hopes and dreams into a system that was fundamentally betraying them at the time. And I think the drift of that frustration was geared more toward law schools. And only recently it's opened up at colleges and universities. I taught critical race theory last year at Walla Walla. And what was fascinating about it was January 6th happened the first week of class. January 6th was on a Wednesday. We had class the first day on Tuesday, on Monday of that week, which would have been the 4th. And the second day of class, I said to them, talked about the permanence of racism. I basically introduced the concepts. We're going to be studying Derek Bell on this, Richard Delgado on this, and so forth. And then the day of the Capitol riots happened, and then the day after that, my students said, "Oh my gosh, Derek Bell was right." I was like, "Did you see all those angry white people?" And this is a class full of white people, right? I think there was one Black person in that class, right? He'd pop in every now and then. I taught that class. I wasn't vaccinated yet, so I taught the class virtually. And he'd show up. I'd see his little picture at the bottom of the screen. He said, "Hey, Dr. Goldman." His name was Frank. I said, "Hey, Frank, how you doing, brother?" "I'm good, man. Making it out here in these wild streets." But the responses from white students, right? And one white student says, "Well, man, when I go home, I listen to my parents talk to me. These are kids from Idaho, Montana, right? And they're learning this, and they're reading Derek Bell, and they're like, where's this been all my life?" Right? So I think it started out with law schools and colleges and universities, and it just never sort of made its way to elementary schools. And now, given all this, trumped up controversy, they couldn't teach it in elementary schools if they wanted to, right? So, but I think that's why. I think it was a movement that was geared toward legal reform, so they figured if they could train lawyers to think this way, they could turn that into some sort of engineered kind of litigating that would lead to better results or help further the fight that Derek Bell thought was ultimately a losing fight, but that still required lawyers to go to court and try the impossible. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Brother Eugene, go to the mic. Go to the mic.
You're a lawyer. You understand what PD stands for, right?
Public defender.
No.
What does it stand for?
Penitentiary deliverer.
Penitentiary deliverer.
I've been on that end. I've been pro per, Denman versus State of California. I understand jurisdiction specifically, and I really understand institutional racism when it comes to law and what they call legal lynching. That's pretty prevalent. They haven't mentioned the issue of legal lynching, whereas you don't get your constitutional rights. Then your penitentiary deliverer just wants to make you a deal, and she don't want to. Right. She don't want to litigate your case based on the fact that all she wants to do is show up and get a check. So my issue is capitalism, and to me, capitalism means they eat out of your plate and sell you theirs. So
that's heavy right there. Could you say that again?
Capitalism. They eat out of your plate and sell you their plate.
Wow.
That's under the 3M system: missionary, mercenary, military, which is another issue. But what I really was came up here was talking about I forgot what my question was going to be, but I really appreciate what you're saying here, because history specifically means his story. And they don't want to tell you our story. You know, like the significant taking us out of the picture to show that we have major contributions to this country, they don't want to have. So I came in specifically to hear what you had, and I appreciate what you've done here, and it should go a long ways, because I'm see the brother not here, but what I like about it is they say women can't preach, but I see there's more women here than men. When Jesus got crucified, the men ran, the women stood.
Mercy.
So,
Mercy.
so if
That's
I'm
right.
going to combat, I want to know that the sisters is who I would go to combat. Well, I'm infantry, 82nd Airborne,
All right.
and I ain't got no problem fighting with women.
You know, as brother was talking, brother, what's your name again?
Eugene Denman.
Denman?
Denman.
This is good.
Denman, Eugene. Brother Denman was talking, and it reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from Derek Bell is, quote, "If there were no black people, America would have to invent them." Right? I mean, when you talk about the contributions to American culture, right? And you see people saying, don't nobody saying God bless America quite as strong as black people. You know, you watch people perform our cultural icons, whether it's music or any sort of art form, and the arts and the sciences. I mean, the contributions we made are just extraordinary.
Yes.
So, yeah. Thank you.
I want to say one more thing.
Sure.
Since this is Black history, if you take a $2 bill and you look on the green side, you see the first black president, John Hanson. Look at the second table, and you see a brother sitting right there at the table. His name is John Hanson. He's the first president of the United States Continental Federation, which was the original name of America. And old folks used to say $2 bill was jinxie. And I went and I found out what it was. They got a brother on the...
That's why they not in circulation too heavy. That's so wrong. Oh, man.
Brother Eugene,
Thank you.
brother,
Thank you,
brother
for sharing
Eugene,
that.
you're special. Sister Patricia.
Yes.
I appreciate your presentation.
Thank
One of the challenges that I have is that I hear the word white supremacy.
you. Sure.
My Bible tells me God is supreme. Why is it that persons will say, because I hear persons of color say it, white supremacy. They're bigots, white bigotry. We're steady, not we, because I don't refer to them as supreme, but that term is yet being used.
Sure.
You know, that's one of the things. And
Okay.
then you mentioned too about generations upon generations. What we're looking at is descendants from slave owners. You know, anytime a middle school student can tell an African-American child over in Washington, D.C., that your ancestors made this shirt, you know, your ancestors made this shirt, this is middle school. They're being taught in their home. You see what I'm saying? And so that's one of the challenges, because media is media, okay? But I listen to them, I'm like, no, God is supreme, and I know that I have the same brain, the potential to learn as anybody walking on this earth.
Amen.
Period. You know, I know that. But that term, that whole term of white supremacy, it shouldn't even enter into our vocabulary.
Well, so let me just say this. I appreciate your point. I think, however, there's a difference between believing yourself to be supreme and actually being supreme.
Okay.
When we speak of the supremacy of God, we're speaking of, as Christians or as religious believers, we're speaking of an actual state
Yeah,
of affairs,
absolutely.
that God is supreme.
Absolutely.
But when we use the term supreme as it relates to whites and racism, and we say white supremacy, we're not referring to the actual belief that white people are supreme.
Okay.
What we're referring to is the state of affairs in the world in which white people believe themselves to be supreme.
Okay.
And that belief, however false it may be, creates a reality
Okay.
in which we all have to live. So I think those two terms have, in different contexts, they have two very different meanings.
Okay.
So I think when you say white supremacy, you're not saying that whites are supreme. You're referring instead to the false belief that whites have that they are supreme.
Right.
That has created a world in which we have institutions and traditions, et cetera, that perpetuate that false belief.
Okay. And then one other thing, as Jerome stated, I got African American history when I got to UC San Diego. They brought someone out of Philadelphia. No,
Okay.
yeah. I can't
Love it.
think of his name, but they brought him out, and he taught 3/4. But even in his teaching, I just learned about the Tulsa event last year. Okay, so again, you know, and I remember even in taking the class, I had to petition because they had it all set up for European. My curriculum was set up for European history. And I had to petition. I said, well, I would like to learn more about my culture, you know, and they, like I said, they started they changed the school to Thurgood Marshall now. But, you know, I was like, oh my gosh, you know, I thought that I had really learned, and then I took some more classes over at Cal State Long Beach. It never came up. And I actually there was a black economic course. It never came up. You know, so it's like what they want us to learn, you know, is there. You know, what they, you know, and that's why too, I'm an advocate for homeschooling. For the simple fact, you know what your child is getting, okay? And with the laws that are in place, you know, that certain things are against your family values, you're not going to expose your child to it. You're going to let them know that this is not God's plan. Sure. But at this, you understand?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I just, you know, but those are some terms, and I appreciate you sharing that because, like I said, when I hear the term, I'm like, why do they keep saying that? Because, you know, they...
Right. White people, a good way to think of it is this. White people are clearly not God, but they have tried to make themselves to be God-like.
Okay.
Right? In this world, right? But when we speak of God proper, God of the Judeo-Christian tradition, that's an entirely different reference of that word supreme.
Okay. So their perception is that the bottom line is their perception is that they're better than.
Yes.
That's the whole thing.
That's it.
But that's why it's so important that we have to teach our children. We're not talking, you said elementary school. No, before that.
Sure.
Before that. Sure. That you are, you know, there's nothing that you can't learn.
Which says to us, and you're making the point, which says to us that we can only rely on our formal system of education so much, right? We can't heap all the responsibility onto that. We have to share that responsibility by ensuring that we supplement what our kids might not be getting in school, right?
Absolutely.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Excellent. Whoever's next, I'll ask you to make your way. I'm going to ask you, Doc, you mentioned 3 points regarding critical race theory,
yes.
And I want to go to, I believe it's the first point, that it is a part that racism is permanent. It's infiltrated, incorporated in every facet
yes.
of this life here. What does that mean for religion? Because for black people, religion and the God of the religion they belong to is supreme. And so if race and racism, which is in turn meaning whiteness, because Jesus has to be white. You know, Jesus has to be white. And the children of slaves accept this now. So that even a couple of weeks ago when I said Paul was black, it was like, what text is that in? What if I said he was white, that wouldn't be asked. You see what I'm saying? If I just enunciated that Paul was white and stuff, nobody would say what text it in because it would be automatically accepted. Because I said he was black, I need a text to prove that. Because me is not in the book or is not prevalent in the book. So what aspect of race and this aspect of critical race theory, that race and white supremacy has infiltrated every aspect of the life here in America, what does that mean for those of us who practice a religion, really a syncretic religion, that has adopted aspects of that belief in our pictures, in our teachings, matter of fact, in our prophecies, because every prophecy that we talk about in Revelation or Daniel only relates to Western civilization and does not relate at all or say anything about Africa, does not say anything about China, does not say anything about everything we understand has to do from Greek to Rome to America, and don't see ourselves of where we fit in.
The implications are to answer your question, the implications of this idea that race permeates everything for religion are things that you just mentioned. We have a theology that is fundamentally Western in its orientation. We only address from Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, and contemporary Europe, as though the rest of the world doesn't exist, as though there's nothing in Africa, as though there's nothing in China, and this is part and parcel of a Western intellectual heritage that is fundamentally not only racist, but in some sense anti-Semitic in origin, because Martin Luther was no fan of Jewish people. Martin Luther wrote a racist tract in 1543, I think it was just about 3 years before he died, titled "The Jews and Their Lives." And in that text, if I'm not mistaken, he condemns them for their swarthy complexions and their broad noses.
So he's not talking about the Arabian Jews that occupy and stuff now. That's all I'm saying.
That's right. So for example, people have asked me, well, how does enlightened Europe end up with Hitler? Here's how. You have Luther, who's not a fan of Jews. Luther's work gets passed on to the philosophical and intellectual work of Immanuel Kant, who does not see Judaism as a religion. And then you move from Immanuel Kant to Hegel, German philosopher, who says that he has a philosophy of history, and he's only talking about the history of the West. In fact, for him, Africa doesn't have a history. Africa operates outside of history. Remember what I said about being disconnected from your history? Right? I think a lot of people in the church want you to be disconnected from your history so that you, A, you don't know who you are, and B, they can tell you who you are.
That's right. That's right.
That's a problem. And the problem with our theology is that we have so separated ourselves from our history that we have died. We are literally the walking dead. We're functional, we come to church on Sabbath, we do this, we dress the right way, we say all the right things, but we are socially and politically and spiritually dead. And the reason why is because we have inherited a theology that is informed by a certain anti-Semitic and racist tradition that tells us that we don't have a history. And what did we say this morning or earlier this afternoon about the man who was tossed into the sepulcher of Elisha. If being put in contact with his bones brought him back to life, that implies that when he was disconnected from those bones, he was dead. And we have been disconnected. So the implications of the belief that racism affects everything, including religion, are a lot of the things that you mentioned, and I think chief among them is a complete rejection of African American history by African Americans. And that is very dangerous.
There's a word you haven't used yet. It's called institutional racism. Institutional racism specifically needs to be addressed here because there's a practice.
I'm sorry, they're asking you to come to the mic.
You haven't come to the issue of what's called institutional racism, which is a practice that they use for legally lynching or doing whatever. There's an institutional practice of racism, specifically in religion, blah, 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 blah. Racism is institutionalized. So I'm not really good with the word institutionalized, but it's a practice that's prevalent.
You know, you said something. You've used this phrase, and I meant to say this the first time. I think I forgot that you came up. Legal lynching.
Legal lynching.
That's a fascinating terminology because it's important to note that Derek Bell does not derive his insights from critical race theory out of thin air. He is working within a tradition of African American intellectual history that goes all the way back to the 19th century, to 19th century black abolitionists like Martin Delany, who had an emigration strategy, who basically said, this country isn't getting any better, we should leave.
Sounds like a good plan.
Right, right, exactly, that was Martin Delany. And Derek Bell is also writing, and that's right.
Garvey specifically.
Garvey, that's right, Garvey, it was Delany too.
That's what I'm saying, but Delaney was pre-Garvey.
That's right, Delany,
Before
Garvey, yeah, he was. Delany, Garvey, and in the 1930s, to your phrase legal lynching, Ralph Bunche, Harvard political theorist, said in an article, I think it was in the Journal of Negro Education, 1935, he said black people can never expect to get just treatment in the courts because the courts operate at a level of abstraction that ignores the realities of black life. So it ignores history, exactly. And what happens when we ignore history?
You repeat the same
People
thing.
die. God have mercy.
Well, they've been lynching us for a while.
Legal lynching. I love that phrase. And Derek Bell wrote, when Barack Obama was running for president, Derek Bell published his magnum opus, his greatest work, Race, Racism, and American Law, in 2008. And he wrote in the preface, he was writing about Ralph Bunche, and he said, I know people aren't going to like this, but Barack Obama, of course, was one of Derek Bell's students. When he was because Derek Bell's the first tenured African-American law professor in the history of Harvard. He was a tenured African-American professor at Harvard, and he left Harvard because he went on in protest, he took an extended leave of absence because Harvard had failed to hire a black woman law professor. And Harvard Law School told him, you gotta come back. If you don't come back, we're gonna fire you. He said, I'm not coming back until you hire a black woman. They fired him, and then they hired a black woman. Lanny Guinier, who is now a distinguished professor of law at Harvard, right? But the point is that Bell is saying in Race, Racism, and American Law, he says, despite the pride many African Americans feel about President Obama, about Senator Obama, I hate to say this, but it is highly unlikely that if he survives the many obstacles to his nomination and becomes president, that anything will change for black people, right? And Derek Bell didn't die until 3 years or 2.5 years into Obama's first term. And sure enough, one of his interviews, he's an older man, I think he was 84 when he died, so he's in his 80s, and he had He wasn't always as, he was just an older looking man, but he stood there and talked, not unlike this one in a small library in New York City, where he was visiting professor of law at NYU for the rest of his career after Harvard got rid of him. And he was talking to a group of people like this, and he said, when he talked about interest convergence, he not only talked about Barack Obama, but he talked about the Brown versus Board of Education decision. He said that was interest convergence. You know why? Because after all these black veterans came back from World War II, the country looked bad. The country looked terrible. You got all these people that are fighting overseas against a racist Hitler, and they come home to face a racist George Wallace.
Okay.
And so he said the Brown decision wasn't about racism being wrong. You know what he said? The Brown decision was an anti-communist decision because Russians were accusing America of hypocrisy because of Jim Crow. And so we've never done the right thing by black people just because we gotta do the right thing. It's always because white interests dictate what's gonna happen, and black folk happen to intersect with it, so yeah, let's come along. Yeah.
Dr. Golden, don't see anyone else coming up. I have one more thing for you. It's good to talk about problems. It's good to identify.
Yes.
It's good to talk about problems. It's good to be able to identify the various issues. As a pastor, as a church, where can we go, as Dr. King wrote, where do we go from here, because it becomes a challenge to coalesce your own people to a single direction, even a single belief, when things that are believed is anti your community. I hope the folk are following me, that in the things that can benefit us as a people, we don't speak on because there's some theological things that are stopping us that we should even address. Because, God is not white, God is not black, God is not any of these, so why should we as his people have to deal with these things? And sometimes we become so aloof in our belief system that we don't know how to navigate the struggles that people are facing every day. So we identified things. Derek Bell and Delgado tried to establish critical race theory that's being attacked now. But how do we, as a people, have my Samoan brothers and we have our Hispanic, and what can we do to begin the process of setting up opportunities to teach? Brother Walker asked, well, I didn't learn this. How come it's not being taught in elementary? I can't expect someone who hates me. I can't expect someone who doesn't see me as I've told my church before, this is the only nation in the history of nations that in its constitution, in its legislative body, has a people as less than human, as 3/5 human. We are 3/5. And then I'm supposed to believe that the education system that they set up is supposed to teach me my full human worth. So when do we as a church begin to say, great, we're Adventists, great, we're this, but our responsibility to our children, to our youth, has to go beyond what we're doing for 2 hours on Saturday?
Pastor, as you were talking, I think about the point that I made earlier that you asked me to repeat when I said that many of our black forebears in the Seventh-day Adventist Church had a greater sense of duty to their community than they did to the institution.
That's right.
And I think we have to start there. Now, that makes a good SDA really uncomfortable.
Yeah, but let me pause there,
Right.
because we've also been enculturated to move out of our communities.
Right.
because
Right.
the better communities are not where we are.
Right. That's exactly right. So I think you have to begin, like today, what brings me so much joy today is that I had dinner at church. I thought that was just wonderful. And the hospitality has been tremendous, so thank you. And my compliments to the chefs, the food was delicious. Whoever cooked, everything I ate tasted good. And one of the reasons why it tasted so good was because I wasn't sitting in front of my computer. I was sitting, virtual fellowship is lame. I'm gonna just put that out there, right? I am not in my house this weekend, right? If I was at home, I'd be sitting at home either looking at a sermon or, I got addicted to lion documentaries on YouTube. Like, I love to watch like a pride takeover. Like the males come in and they kick out the other males and poor babies, they kill the cubs. And oh man, it's terrible, right? It's like a soap opera. And the narrator's always some British guy. Hunger for days. If she doesn't eat soon, the pride will vanish, And that's like I got into that, right? But I'm not doing that today. Yes. And the reason I'm not doing that today is because I'm with people. Yes. And I think the pandemic has sort of short-circuited the one thing that our church does very well, which is come together. Because it's through that coming together that we build community, and it's through building community that you have connection and that you have a sense of obligation to those people that transcends whatever institutional directives or norms may be. And if we don't start there with a deep sense of connection and community to one another and a sense of duty, that's right? A sense of duty that tells me, if the church tells me to do something, or the church tells me I shouldn't be doing something, that my good sense and brother or sister so-and-so in the church needs help, and the church tells me I'm not supposed to do it, that God gave you a brain for a reason. Yes. That's crazy. Yes. Right? I mean, we love abstraction in the church. And one of the reasons why we love abstraction is because it keeps us from being accountable. We can sit around, some of the conversations I've heard over the years being in the church, and I've been in the church for a long time, right? So I can talk about it. You've been to go to potlucks, and people say, well, what about, will there be toilets in your mansion in heaven? What are we talking about? What is, meanwhile, people out here dying. Yeah. Right? Because we're more interested in being right than we are in doing righteousness. And when I think if we take Matthew 25 seriously, when God returns, he's not going to be interested in your theological pursuit. That's right. Watch out. He don't care what your doctrines were, what you believe. That's right. The question is, what did you do for him as represented in the face of the least of these? That's right. And so we have to create community that says to us, God gave us a brain, use it, and it's not to say that we, are going to overthrow the church, but it's to recognize the church as a human institution, which is by nature fallible, and it's to recognize that community, that Christ did not find community with the general conference. That's right. He found community with prostitutes. That's right. Yes. Right? Yes. He found community with lepers. That's right. He found community with people who have been disconnected from history. That's right. And he reconnected them. Right? So I think we have to focus on the things that we have historically done well, particularly in our black SDA churches. Because we get together, right? And the pandemic has destroyed so much of that, but we have to start to be intentional about trying to reclaim that because you can't have no community through a computer. I just, that's a real problem. So, yeah.
Thank you. I always when I said folk are going to work, folk are going to school, folk are going to, but when it comes to church, well, is it safe?
Right. Right.
100,000 people at SoFi Stadium to see the Super Bowl, 80,000 people over here,
Right.
and everybody going, but when it's time for church, is it safe?
And it's really just a small thing, you know?
Yeah.
It's coming together, it's just getting to, it's connection,
Yeah,
right? Which I think is so important.
that's right. Yes.
You guys make so many good points in here. First of all, this is my first time in an Adventist church in my life, so this has been amazing. This is so different than any church I've ever been to. And I was raised in a Pentecostal church, and you didn't challenge anything, so this is this is like a whole nother world to me. But there were so many great points made. Almost everybody that came up, I was just like, yeah, you know. But in particular, this sister here, I want to thank you for what you were saying about school, and also it's going to go into my question. You were talking about the Brown versus Board of Education and it being interest convergence as to why we got that, not some type of moral thing, right?
Sure.
When we think about Brown versus Board of Education and interest convergence, you know, part of it was optics and Russians, like you said, the Russians creating propaganda, but the other thing I was thinking about is prior to that, there were black schools with black teachers, black principals, and they were teaching black stuff, stuff that would empower their communities, right? And Brown versus Board of Education, when that happened, a lot of those black schools got shut down. And so then the black kids had to go to the white school. So it wasn't just, they tell you that one story about somebody lived far away from the black school and they wanted to go to a closer white school, and that's not really, there's not a lot that backs up that story, that narrative that you talk about, how we tell these stories. In fact, from what I understand, a lot of communities actually just wanted more funding for their schools, and instead of doing that, they said, okay, we'll put you in these schools. So it looks good for them, but also I was wondering, does that also combine with, does interest convergence in CRT also include creating controlled opposition? Meaning, we're less of a threat as black people if we're not together in the same way. If you're in our school system and learning what we want you to learn from our white teachers, and we're teaching you about your history and your people in our way, does that then create black people who we can now control, right? Because you don't know who you really are. You've been conditioned to believe that you were this person, and you were conditioned to believe that you had this history from white teachers, or even if your teacher wasn't white, they were teaching a white curriculum. I call school the indoctrination station. So I agree with you about homeschooling, or at least creating communities where we can educate ourselves. But I am very curious to see if critical race theory includes that conversation of creating controlled opposition. So now we're less of a threat because we've been indoctrinated with the idea that, oh, we're all one, we're all happy. Meanwhile, the schools are more segregated today than they were in 1954. People don't know that. It's literally more segregated today. They created suburbs, and white people moved out of the communities that they were integrating, right? So now we're kind of almost, what's the word I'm looking for? We're stuck in this system where they do have the power. They do have the power to tell our children who they are. They do have the power to tell our children that their value is this and their history is that, you know? But there's this belief that every single black person was forced desegregation. There was a lot of opposition to that. That's right. Because of what did ultimately happen, a lot of black communities, such as Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was not destroyed by the massacre, by the way. They always end the story at the massacre, and that's not where it ended. Actually, they rebuilt after the massacre. That's right. And they were still profitable, and what ultimately destroyed it was desegregation and urban renewal policies. So, I mean, but my overall point really is just about how we've been taught our history. Does that create a situation where black people are now controllable? So now we have black spaces and high spaces, but we're not getting the results that we want. We have a black president, a black face, who, by the way, is not African American, if we're being honest, in the sense that his father's from Kenya. His ancestors did not build this country. These aren't his black ancestors, right? But he's a black face in a high space. And now we feel like, oh, there's a change because it looks good. We got black people on covers of magazines that have existed for 100 years, and we're, oh my God, the first black person on the cover of Vogue. And they've been, like we just got invented last year.
Right.
Right? So that's pretty much my question.
No, well, thank you, Siobhan, for that question. So a couple things. One, I think the short answer to your question about black people being controlled is yes, and Derek Bell calls that racial symbols, right? So Derek Bell will say, you look at Barack Obama and you see that as racial progress, it's just a symbol. What I referenced this morning in the sermon about 4 women on the Supreme Court who are all of different races, different ethnicities, etc. There's people who will look at that under the concept of diversity, which is just a word that we use to make black people less important in conversations about racial justice. And they will look at that, and this is what people on the left will do, right? People on the left will say, oh, that's just wonderful. Look at the rainbow of colors and different religions. But as I said this morning, that's not going to do anything to help black people. In fact, to your point, Siobhan, the fascinating thing about black people who ascend to high spaces is that they really don't get to create the game. They're more like chess pieces. In other words, in chess, you can only move each piece in a certain predetermined direction. And when some people take office, I'm not casting aspersions against, all black people who hold political offices or what have you, but speaking generally, you can have situations in which black people occupy positions that if they were white, they would have much more influence, but because they are black, they have to move like chess pieces. If you're a knight and you're playing chess, you can only move in the L shape. So if I'm black and I run some sort of government bureaucracy or some sort of industry, I can only move here. And I live in a gilded cage. Because on the outside, I have all the power, but I don't really, my office is almost a sinecure, right? I don't have any real power. I appear to have power, but I don't. So yeah, I think so. That's his notion of racial symbols. The other point I wanted to make when you brought up Brown versus Board, and I'm glad you did, Derek Bell has a book that he wrote called Silent Covenants, The Unfulfilled Hopes of Racial Reform. And in that book, in chapter 3, he says that Plessy versus Ferguson, the decision that said separate but equal was the law, he says the Supreme Court made a mistake when they decided Brown, because rather than overturn Plessy versus Ferguson, the court should have affirmed Plessy versus Ferguson and demanded that Southern states fund segregated black schools with the same amount of money and resources that they gave white schools. Well, which is the continuing fight over Brown, right? That you still have, like, as Siobhan pointed out, you got schools that they're still not equal. They're less equal now than they ever were. That's right. At any point in American history. And so Derek Bell reimagines the Brown decision to say, what would happen if they upheld separate but equal and actually made black education equal? That's right. Because here's the thing. Derek Bell's first scholarly essay that got him tenure at Harvard was called Serving Two Masters, Conflicts of Interest in School Desegregation Litigation. Here's the kicker. The black parents of the kids never wanted their kids to go to white schools. That's right. That's right. They just wanted them to have equal resources. And this created a conflict of interest with the NAACP lawyers, Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall, because they were pushing a desegregation agenda that was not necessarily the goal of their clients. So what do you do when you have this conflict of interests, right? Again, Harry Briggs Jr., the little boy, who was one of the lead plaintiffs in the Brown versus Board of Education case, his father served in World War II. And his father fought Hitler in Europe and came home, and his kid had to walk 5 miles to school each way and sit in a one-room shack with 20 other kids and one teacher. They had no books, or the books they had were falling apart. Harry Briggs Sr. went to the NAACP and said, I want my child to have an equal education, and they shouldn't have to walk 5 miles to school to get it. That's what they wanted. So desegregation becomes part of what I think might be a more sinister agenda to advocate the idea that just because you end Jim Crow and you can go to school with white people, that you therefore should go to school with white people. See?
Well, we say desegregation.
Desegregation.
They say integration.
They say integration.
But it was us being integrated to them, not them being.
That's right. If there's it's more, it becomes assimilation.
Right.
At some point, right? And Siobhan made this point earlier, eating lunch. I got to give you credit for this. This is really, Al Sharpton made the point years ago that the initial desegregation cases were about public accommodations, right? Things that black people were paying taxes for, they didn't have access to. Parks, schools, and the civil rights legislation basically ended Jim Crow for public and private, for everything. And so there's just a lot to unpack and think about here. But it's fascinating that many of the black plaintiffs in the Brown case never wanted integrated schools. They wanted equal schools.
Let's give Dr. Golden a big hand.
Thank you. Thank you, Big T.
I hope I was going to have you come up.
No, I wanted to ask, Doc, ask you a quick question. I'm old enough to remember when I grew up.
Pastor Harrison?
I am he.
Oh, man, we go way
Yes,
back.
sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
I'm old enough. I grew up not far from here in a little city called Redlands, and I'm old enough to remember that what we call desegregation, where they bust us from where we lived to where the white folks and put us in their school. There was never a white in their area, in their neighborhoods, come to our neighborhood to go to school. So it was never a two-way street. It was a one-way, us going to them. You're teaching at Walla Walla.
Yes, sir.
What impact have you seen as you're teaching and sharing and all of those things with the students there? Have you seen any impact or differences in the students that you teach, as well as the community there or the school itself, as you teach these kinds of things to faculty as well as the students?
Sure. Well, the impact that I've seen is, first of all, as a black person on a majority white campus that's a faculty member, whenever something goes wrong in the world and the university feels like it has to protect their brand when it comes to race, they come looking for me. Right? 2 years ago, in May of 2020, when the pandemic was sort of just, gearing up and rolling out, and George Floyd was killed, a day after seeing that trauma on TV and everything, I was called and asked to address the entire university in university assembly, not in person, but from my computer.
From your
I ain't lying. I'm gonna take that webcam when I get home and run my car over that thing, right? And here's the thing. I'm not complaining, right?
Right.
But it's a burden when you get asked to do it. But I know that if I don't do it, they're gonna have somebody else do it, and they ain't. I mean, everybody ain't always right about what they say.
That's right.
And they bring some other black person up there to, we're all God's children, Jesus loves us. I told the university assembly, Jesus was on the cross, cried out for his father. George Floyd on the ground called out for his mother.
Yeah. See?
And if you don't see the face of the Savior in George Floyd, you need to check your religion.
That's right.
And, so people have told me that, Tim, that was great thing you said, and so forth. So I struggle because it is when I came to Walla Walla, my life basically started over again. And to have to go through some of the personal turmoil and then take on this new job and, negotiate race in these. Negotiating race in a theological space is like, you ought to get a gold medal for gymnastics if you can do that, right? Because,
A lot of moving
a lot
pieces.
of the brethren, they hang on to that doctrine, man. I call that doctrine worship.
That's right.
They're stuck to that, and they can't get out of these certain habits they have. But I'll tell you a story that really impacts me, and I don't always see the impact I have on students, but I had a student who graduated last year. By the way, if I could just give a little commercial, not to boast, but our 3 graduates of our pre-law program at Walla Walla last year are all in their first year of law school on full scholarship.
Come on now.
Right?
Awesome.
And I'm just so happy for them, right? And there's one young lady, she's Latina. She took critical race theory from me last year when I taught it. She graduated in June. She's at Penn State on full scholarship. And Penn State Law School. I recently wrote her a letter of recommendation for an internship with the Latino Judges Association in New York City. And she's going to be a judicial, if she had got in, she was going to be a judicial intern. Well, she called me this week and she said, Dr. Golden, I'm so happy. She said, the letter you wrote me, I got into the program. I'm so happy. I don't know what to say. And when you have a student tell you that you've been a good influence on them, I told her, I said, you don't know. I said, girl, you just made my year. I could lay down and go to sleep and wake up and it could be 2023 and I'd be all right. You just really made me feel good about what I do. So I try to see, what I do is a career for sure, but I try to see it as a vocation, right? As a call. And I just want to be faithful. I want to do what I can. And I do see it's hard sometimes to read students, but I think that students appreciate hearing this perspective. But they, deep down inside, they don't want to get too excited because for them, they know it's still Walla Walla, right? But I will say this, there's only about 10 schools in the United States where you could take a course in African American philosophy. Walla Walla University is one of them. I have taught that class 3 times in my 7 years here at Walla Walla, and I have never had an African American in that class. Not once. I went to the Black History Sabbath celebration at the beginning of the month at the University Church, and I'm looking, I see all these beautiful black people. I said, you go to school here? Yeah, I go to school here. I said, what's your name? I said, oh yeah, you Dr. Goldman. I said, yeah, I heard about your class, man. Your class hard. You got people in there writing papers and, trying to explain stuff. I said, man, so I wish I could have more, right, of an impact. But you just go with the flow and do what you can. So I think I'm making a difference. I certainly hope I am, and I'll just keep doing my best.
So Walla Walla's Washington, right?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
No, man.
No.
If I left, the population would drop by about 85%.
I was in every Washington and I counted 4 black people in 30 days.
I believe it.
Listen, we have another program. We want to be able to support our children and our social ministry that's going to have the bookmobile outside, and Erica and Madison and Channing have done a wonderful job. There'll be snacks and different things out there as well. I know that they've worked diligent to try to get some high school students to volunteer and different people from the community, so we definitely want to be there to support. But once again, we want to thank Dr. Golden.
Thank you, Thank you so much.
I wish that we wouldn't have to wait for Black History to have these kind of talks and to have these kind of realities, and hopefully we won't. Before I have Pastor Harrison come up to give us our closing prayer, I already told you, Doc, one of my elders told me, make sure you act right, your boss is here. But no, that's my golfing buddy as well. But just to pay it forward, just in case you don't know, I want to end with this. So Dred Scott was a slave. How many of you know Dred Scott? How many of you know the history, the story behind Dred Scott? Okay? So Dred Scott was a slave who had been freed, and his slave owners freed him and things like that. And then the slave owners died, and then the courts, the American system wanted to keep him as a slave, pretty much. And so you have to think about, and it was a plantation in Alabama. And the family moved back to Missouri. And in order to have the legal, if you really need representation here in America, what do you need? What's that, Chris? Money. You need money to have good representation, to have a good lawyer. You need money. You talked about that.
Innocent until proven broke.
That's right. Did you hear that? Innocent until proven broke. That's the reality for our people. But Dred Scott, I'm trying to think, because that was not his real name. But the plantation that his family owned, and the portion outside of, portion outside of Alabama, and they moved to Missouri, it was the slave owners' children that paid for his legal fees. Yeah, it was the slave owners' children that paid for his legal fees, even though they lost the case, right?
That's right.
Even though the case was lost, the government said, no, you're a slave. The plantation, a little bit outside of what was then Huntsville, that now has become a part of Huntsville, is that the plantation where he's from is now what Oakwood University was built on.
Wow.
How many of you knew that?
No idea.
Good. So Oakwood University is the actual grounds of a slave plantation that the prophet saw that God would use to educate the black people here in the United States. What a tremendous history that we have that so many do not know. And if you don't know what God has done, you don't know what God can do. So I challenge you, and I challenge my church continually. You don't have to beg God to do what He has done. He's done it. You don't have to think or worry. Ask God to do things that you haven't seen Him do yet. See, that's what we need to ask God. What He has done. Listen, my belief system says what He has done, He's already given us the power and shown us that we can do it.
Amen.
But what we can't do is what we need to ask Him to do.
All right.
And don't ask Him to do what He's already done. Let's begin to ask Him to do what we have not yet seen. And then we can believe in the God of the impossible. Unkulunkulu. to supreme God. Imlundosi, the God of our ancestors. For you and I shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of waters. Then we will be trees that give life to others. And we should not be about anything else other than when others come in contact with us, their lives are enriched. Let's stand. I'm going to ask Pastor Harrison to come, and then Channing, we're finished. We're going to come out, and after Pastor Harrison prays, do you have anything you want to say, Channing, to prep anything? Okay. So after Pastor Harrison prays, just take a seat for a couple minutes so we can hear what Channing can let us know is set up for us and set up for our kids.
Let's pray. Father, we thank you right now in the name of Jesus. We're grateful for this great day, this Sabbath day. We thank you for the knowledge that has been shared with us. Lord, someone said knowledge is power. But Lord, when we know who we are and whose we are, it's most powerful. And so, God, we just thank you for Dr. Golden being here and sharing with us. We thank you for Dr. Sylvester for what he has brought here in his team. And then, Lord, I thank you for everyone who is here tonight. We pray, God, that it has been a blessing and that we all have grown from what we've learned today. Now, Lord, we pray that you'll bless and keep us, watch over us. And then, Lord, all that we say and do, Lord, we pray that we'll do it to your name, honor, and glory. Dismiss us from this place, but never from your divine presence is our prayer, as we ask it all in Christ's name. Amen.